the last set of presentations for the day. Very much appreciate you guys coming to see the IDRA conference. Just to do a quick introduction in case we have a couple people here that this is their first IDRA thing. IDRA is the Indigent Defense Research Association. We're a multidisciplinary group of practitioners and researchers kind of passing information back and forth to improve our understanding and delivering of public defense. As you just heard or saw, we are recording this presentation, so just so you know. And this will be posted on the IDRA YouTube in the coming weeks or so. This presentation, there will be a large question period that you will very clearly see. So you can feel free to drop questions in the chat, but we will just kind of bank those until the question and answer portion / discussion portion. And with that, I will pass it off to the group here.
Thank you so much, Torin, and thank you to IDRA. We're so excited to be a part of this opportunity. My name is Laurel Arroyo. I work in California, and I'm going to introduce our panelists and the team at the Indigent Defense Improvement Division. So what do we do? The Office of the State Public Defender has been doing appellate representation in capital cases for a very long time, and some of you may have seen Lisa Romer earlier today. She is on our team. But we also are working with all the counties in California to try to improve their indigent defense systems if they ask for help. We have no mandate in terms of requiring anything, but we are here for technical assistance and training of attorneys. And so let me introduce our panelists today. We have Tatyana Kaplan, who is on our team. She is a researcher. She used to work for the Department of Justice, and so we're glad to have gotten her now on our side to use her mad skills in surveys, charts, data collection. She uses her PhD and her smarts to tell us how to collect data, and then she makes beautiful representations, which you'll see in our presentation, which are very compelling. My name's Laurel. I worked as a trial level public defender for about 17 years in Alameda County, and now I've been in this unit running the capacity building unit for just a little over 2 years. Bridgid-Leigh Brady was a trial level public defender in Tulare County for about 11 years before she came to our team just over a year ago. And Ashanti Mitchell was a trial level public defender in Santa Clara County, which is where San Jose is, for about 11 years before he came to our team over a year ago. And so what we're going to talk about today is what we're trying to do in California to kind of move counties away from contract systems and move them towards institutional public defenders, because we all know they have much better results for clients. And so what we're going to talk about first is what we did to kind of map California to figure out where the issues are. And then we're going to talk about quantitative and qualitative data that we collected and used for evaluations of contract systems. And then Tatyana is going to jump in and talk about how she has used RAND's National Public Workload Study to support a couple of institutional public defender offices with increasing staffing. So she's going to give one case study on that. And then we're going to open up for questions and ideas. So just to give you a tiny bit of background on California, California has 58 counties, and we are kind of like Texas or New York. It's a county-based choice system. You don't have to have a public defender office. You could do a contract system. And 25 of our counties do not have public defender offices at this point. Most of them are contracts that are just with the county with individual lawyers. A couple of them are managed assigned counsel systems. And some of them, 6 counties, also have law firms that are running the contract system. And what we did before we did these evaluations, or during, actually, we had done one evaluation, but we did a survey of the 58 counties. And through some competitive survey analysis, we all competed with each other to see who could get the most counties to respond. Our team was able to get 100% return rate on the survey. And it was some simple questions. And we have 2 reports that came out of that data, which we're happy to share with you. But it's things like who's collecting flat fees, who has investigators, who has social workers, who has alternate defenders, which ones, just what basic system level questions to kind of get a sense of what's happening around the state. And then what we've been doing, which is the deep dive, are these deep reports on specific contract counties. And that's mostly what we're going to talk to you about today. So before Ashanti and Bridgid got here, I was invited to do an evaluation in Del Norte County, which is up at the top of California next to Oregon and just has 4 contract attorneys. And so you can see it's kind of a rinky-dink report because that was just me. And then we added Ashanti and Bridgid and Tatyana to our team, and things got a lot more complicated and sophisticated with data. And so we're happy to share these reports with you, but they talk about in depth the data that we're going to share with you today. And each of these 3 reports makes a case that the contract system is failing, and they have very similar problems in each county that they all need institutional public defender office. So I'm going to turn it over to Tatyana to talk about what kind of quantitative data she's gotten and where she gets it from.
Thank you, Laurel, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having us again. So during our evaluations and evaluating different indigent defense systems, we rely on several sources of data when producing or developing these evaluations. This data can include data from nonprofit organizations. We rely a lot on population data. We try to gather as much criminal justice data as we can. County level data is especially helpful for us for the reason Laurel explained, and especially when it comes to county budgets. And we also include data pertaining to workloads, but I'll talk about that later, and data from client experience surveys that we develop and distribute. So over the next few slides, we're going to briefly review quantitative data sources and the data that they offer. And then Bridgid and Ashanti will do a deeper dive into showing examples of how those data have been used in county evaluations. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with VERA, but for those who may not be aware, we utilize a good amount of data from the VERA Institute, which is an independent nonprofit research and policy organization. VERA collects a substantial amount of data related to incarceration and allows users to look at incarceration rates at both the state and county levels. VERA also offers county-specific profiles, and these are really, really helpful. So in addition to having jail and prison incarceration rates, the county profiles also include arrest rates at the county level, information on the types of offenses for the arrests, information on racial disparities in arrests, and they also include some county budgetary spending breakdowns as well. And another nonprofit organization, the Prison Policy Initiative, I'm sure you all have heard of that, but for those that may not be familiar, it also offers a wealth of similar data, and I highly recommend checking both of those out. One quick thing to keep in mind is both sites utilize data, I believe, from slightly different sources and perhaps different time periods. So just make sure to do a good read-through of their methodology section so you have a good idea of any limitations pertaining to the data on these sites. Next slide, please. Another common source of data that we use includes U.S. Census data. We primarily use census data to obtain population counts for counties, mostly so that we can then use that data to standardize some of the other data points so that we can make cross-county comparisons, statewide average comparisons, so have you. We also use data from the California State Bar, which has data on counts and demographic information on attorneys with active licenses, and they offer this information broken down by county. So that's been really helpful for us as well. Thanks, Laurel. One of our most consistent sources of data is from an annual report produced by the Judicial Council of California, which is essentially the policymaking arm of the California court system. And luckily for us, the Judicial Council releases this report and includes a variety of court statistics, including dispositions and filings, clearance rates, and the number and types of trials. And especially helpful for our purposes is that a good chunk of this data is presented at the county level, which gives us then an opportunity to make comparisons, again, at the state level and across counties. Another source that we often utilize, I think it's almost become my favorite data source, is our county budgets. The most boring thing you could ever read, but I love them. County budgets are primarily available online and contain a lot of information on staffing counts and position allocations for district attorney offices and public defender offices if the county has one. And we also utilize budgets to see how the county is allocating its funds between prosecution and public defense so that in our evaluations, we're able to speak to parity in funding. Our state controller's office has dashboards that are searchable with county budget information, but unfortunately, staffing information is not included in that. Bridget?
Thank you, Tatyana. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my evaluation of a rural county in California that uses a contract indigent defense system. As Laurel mentioned, I was a deputy public defender in the Central Valley of California, a county called Tulare County. And Kings County is just next door. So just to set the scene, these are neighboring counties. The county seats are about a 20-minute drive apart. And as an attorney practicing in Tulare County, Kings County's reputation precedes it in terms of the incarceration rate. And so a lot of clients that I had in Tulare County that also had a case in Kings County, reputationally, all the players in court, the prosecutor, myself, the judge, the probation officer would say, well, let's just trail our case behind Kings County. We know this unfortunate person is going to ultimately end up being sent to prison. So in going into evaluate Kings County, I was keeping an open mind, but that certainly was on my mind, this incarceration rate. So if we want to just go to the next slide. This is from Vera. This reddish color line at the top of the line graph represents the Kings County prison incarceration rate. And then the gray and black lines are the California incarceration rate and US incarceration rate. And you can see that there's a really radical departure in terms of the percentage of people that Kings County sends to prison. It's been departs significantly from state and national trends and has done so for the last 25 years or so. When I was interviewing people in Kings County and asking them, what's the deal with the incarceration rate, a lot of them wanted to almost reflexively chalked it up to the fact that Kings County is home to 3 California state prison facilities. And so there was a tendency to point to that as, well, we have a higher violent crime rate. We have these prisons in the county. So all the, criminal offenses that occur within the prison are chalked up to Kings County, and that's why our incarceration rate is so high. We want to go to the next slide, Laurel. So we're able to disprove that. So you see here the bar graph on the left accounts for the adult imprisonment rate in Kings County, the orange color, and then we pulled a couple of other comparison counties. Imperial, Marin, and Riverside counties also have state prisons in them. And then in green, the California rate. And then on the right-hand side, the violent crime rate for those same jurisdictions. And you can see Kings County, the violent crime rate is not any higher than the state average. On the left, the incarceration rate is way higher than these other comparison counties and the state average. Next slide. So in addition to looking at this publicly available incarceration data, I also sent requests to these different offices and entities asking for information. And it's important to note that in California, there's no state oversight of indigent defense systems, and there's no requirement that counties collect or report this data. So there was a little bit of back and forth and trying to figure out what the right office is, probation telling me, no, you have to ask the court for that. The court saying, no, you should ask the sheriff. But ultimately, we were able to get some very important numbers from all of these entities. Next slide. So the question was, how do you measure advocacy? How do you measure the strength or weakness of an indigent defense system? We all know the vast majority of cases don't go to trial, and trial outcomes aren't necessarily indicative of the strength of a defense system. So I wanted to look at a few different points. And one number that I requested was the number of felony motions to dismiss in Kings County. So I requested over a 5-year period, in part because I knew that COVID did affect court proceedings and affected litigation in some places. So I wanted some kind of before, during, and sort of after COVID. So I got those numbers in a vacuum on their own. They didn't really mean much, but then I requested the same data from neighboring Tulare County. Tulare County is a much bigger county, about 3 times the number of annual criminal filings as Kings County, but geographically they're close, politically they're very similar, demographically they're very similar, and in fact a lot of the same attorneys practice in both counties. And then we standardized it per 1,000 cases filed. You could see that in Kings County, this statutory motion is a very common motion that you would file in a felony case. These motions were filed at a much lower rate in Kings County than right next door in Tulare County. And that was also consistent with something that judges reported during my interviews with them, that they noted that there wasn't a lot of litigation, that they didn't have a lot of motion hearings. Next slide. Now, since it's a contract system, of course, they don't have their own in-house investigators. So how it works is the attorney has to fill out a request and give it to the judge, and the judge has to approve an attorney's request for money to hire an investigator to conduct a defense investigation. So I requested the number of those investigation requests that were submitted. So in a 5-year period, there are almost 35,000 adult criminal cases in Kings County, and a defense investigator was requested in fewer than 2,500 of those cases. And so that worked out to about 7% of cases had a defense investigator engaged. It was probably the most shocking number during my evaluation that I came across. And what I told the Board of Supervisors in Kings County was, this number is especially jarring when you consider that the prosecution has had a professional investigation done in 100% of their cases. And then you're looking at just 7% of cases having a defense investigation conducted. A similar procedures in place for requesting experts. The contract attorneys, they're operating as independent contractors. They don't have a budget for hiring experts. So again, they have to submit a written request to the judge saying, I need a forensic pathologist, I need a DNA expert, I need an accident reconstruction expert. So again, 35,000 cases over a 5-year period. There were only 49 requests submitted for expert funding during that time. So next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Ashanti to talk about San Benito County.
Thanks, Bridget. So my name is Ashanti Mitchell. Like Laurel said at the beginning, I was a trial level public defender in Santa Clara County, which is in the Bay Area of California. And I did an evaluation in San Benito County. So San Benito County is a rural county in California. It's kind of sandwiched between some of the coastal counties in California that are larger, more urban, and that have public defenders offices, institutional public defenders offices. The county, the DA's office files about 1,500 cases a year. And historically, San Benito County has used a contract system. In the preceding years, before I did the evaluation, they had gone with a firm, a for-profit firm, that had indigent defense contracts in other counties as well. So San Benito County's leadership reached out to us in part due to, I think, some of the trailblazing work that both Laurel and Bridget did in their evaluations. And they said, hey, I think, this might not be working. And we'd like OSP to kind of take a look and do an evaluation of our system. Next slide. And so we did the evaluation, we pulled data. And one of the areas that we looked, like Tatyana mentioned, was budget. And so we pulled the county budget information because we wanted to see how the county was spending their money and what they were prioritizing. And we found that the contract system was not working for a number of reasons. And in part, it was due to the indigent defense system being severely under-resourced and understaffed, and particularly when compared to the amount of funding that was allocated to the district attorney's office and prosecuting cases. So we found that there were parity issues, and that the parity issues were continuing in terms of how the county was prioritizing how they were spending their money. Next slide. And we also found that with specific funding sources. So in California, there was specific funding that was allocated from the state to the counties that the counties were allowed to use at their discretion for different partners or different agencies within the criminal legal system. And so what we found in San Benito County is that the county allocated funding to basically every other piece of their system, with the exception of indigent defense. And so again, this was an issue of parity, and also kind of spoke to just the resources and the under-resourcing of the indigent defense system. Another super interesting thing that we found was that this particular contract system had an incredibly high attorney turnover. Attorneys were getting moved out of the office, attorneys were getting fired from the office, attorneys were quitting. And so we took some of that information and we looked at how long were attorneys actually staying. And we put together this graph that showed that attorneys weren't staying very long. And it was causing negative implications for everyone involved in the system. So, the courts were having a hard time because cases were getting continued and piling up. The district attorneys were frustrated because they were ready to proceed, but cases were getting continued. Clients were experiencing uncertainty. And so really what we saw that there was a significant delay in the amount of time that cases were taking to resolve. Next slide. And then we also saw with motions to suppress that out of the 1,500 cases that were filed, attorneys were only filing 10 motions to suppress a year. And that really spoke to the litigation. So what we found similar with trials was that cases were just not getting litigated. Defenders weren't able to work up cases and they weren't able to advocate in cases. And so by pulling those numbers, we were able to support the idea that the office really was under-resourced. Next slide. And similarly, as I spoke with about the delays in cases, we found when we compared San Benito County across other counties, we selected counties that were similar in size but had institutional public defenders offices. So Tuolumne County and Siskiyou County, for example. And then we looked at the statewide average and we found that San Benito was really it was behind the ball. They were taking a lot longer to resolve cases. And again, this wasn't because they were litigating more, preparing more, or doing more trials. It really seemed like it was because they were under-resourced, and there was this incredibly high attorney turnover. Next slide. So the other thing that we did that I thought was really interesting and cool was that we drafted client experience surveys. And so I think we're going to distribute examples of these surveys in the materials. But our goal was to try to find clients who were not actively being represented by the defenders in that county in that system, but that had been represented at some point in the recent past. Surveys were completely voluntary. And we used kind of our relationships that we built with some of the folks in those systems to help distribute the survey. So we used the probation department. We distributed some through the jail. And then we also distributed some through community-based organizations that provided services to system impacted persons. The questions, we tried to focus them on communication and interaction. So we asked questions, for example, how frequently did they have contact with their attorneys? What was the duration of that contact? We asked if they were able to reach their attorneys while they were in jail or incarcerated. And then we asked for their perception and their perspective on their attorneys' preparedness for their cases and whether they had trusted their attorney's advice. Then we also asked for contextual data. So we asked for information on the type of case, so whether it was a felony or a misdemeanor, whether they received a incarceration sentence as part of their punishment, to see whether that impacted their perceptions and their contact with their attorneys. And we got a lot of information. I think this information was particularly critical because oftentimes just in the broad context of the criminal legal system, our clients' perspectives are overlooked. So we really wanted to include this in our evaluations. And we found that the client's perspective kind of supported what everyone else was saying about the system and what we were finding about the system. Basically that their ratings were really low. So this graph shows ratings on a scale from 1 to 5. These are types of questions that we asked in our surveys. And we see that across the board, the ratings were really low. Interestingly, they were lower for folks who had a harsher punishment. So those folks rated their attorneys even lower. But some of the questions were like, was my attorney prepared for my court date on a scale from 1 to 5? Did my attorney fight for me in my case on a scale from 1 to 5? And this really helped us to see kind of a complete picture of what was happening in San Benito County. Next slide. And then one, I think, significant point of data that we got from the client experience survey was that 67% of surveyed felony clients indicated that they spoke with their defender for less than 5 minutes, and that's for the entirety of their case. And so we found, obviously, that's significantly low amount of time to communicate with a client, explain their charges, the police report, their defenses, and come up with a plan and keep them in the loop for a felony case. But this was the type of data that we got from San Benito, and this was the type of data that really told the story of what was happening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bridget to talk about qualitative data.
All right, thanks, Ashanti. So we've talked about the quantitative data and how we can use that to illustrate the strength or weakness of the level of advocacy and the system itself. But we also collected qualitative data. So here are some of the things that we did to kind of get a bigger picture, more of a story, not just numbers on paper. So we conducted stakeholder interviews, which I sort of referenced when I was speaking earlier. We sat in court and observed court in our respective counties. As Ashanti mentioned, distributed these client experience surveys to get the client perspective and their opinions, and then also had conversations with system impacted persons in these communities. Next slide. Here's a list, sort of just an example of the folks that we spoke to when evaluating these systems. This is not an exhaustive list. This is basically what we would work off of. So the judges, defense attorneys, both who work in the contract system, and then also maybe, you know, private attorneys in the community that you see in court, prosecutors, probation chief, as well as any probation officers that are present in court, the sheriff again, and anybody working under the sheriff, so courtroom bailiffs or transport deputies. The court executive officer is a good person to talk to, and often is the individual you're going to be, you know, reaching out to get some of those data points. So have a good relationship with him or her is a good idea. And then also the jail captain. Now this is going to vary by community and who kind of the power players are, or during your interviews, you know, it would come up, oh, you should talk to so-and-so, you should talk to somebody from Health and Human Services, you should talk to somebody from behavioral health, you should you know, talk to the clerk at the window who gets all the complaints from disgruntled clients who can't reach their attorneys. So this is what we would start with, and then kind of go from there wherever it leads us. Next slide. I found it important in the stakeholder interviews to start with open-ended questions, to sit down with whoever it was and just say, you know, what's your experience been so far working with the attorneys in the indigent defense system in your community? How do you reach one of these attorneys when you need to talk to them? What have you noticed or what do you hear about the people that you work with? And then lead more into specific examples, but really also give people the opportunity to brag about their community. And I was very aware of coming in and being an outsider or somebody that works from the state. Oh, great, here's a state bureaucrat to judge us. But to give people an opportunity to talk about the pros and cons and the strengths and the weaknesses. And, you know, what do you think's working well, or what could it make it better? And ask for some specific examples, especially related to their perception of the data. So for example, in Kings County, I had submitted my data requests, but I hadn't received all of them back at the time I was doing these stakeholder interviews. So it was very revealing to ask, for example, the judges about investigation requests. Judge, how many investigation requests do you get from contract attorneys? Oh, I get them all the time. I'm always having to sign off on those things. You know, I sit down with a stack of them every week. If it goes past the first pretrial, I definitely get an investigator request. Well, then come to find out the data request came back and I got that number showing, you know, 7% of cases had a defense investigator engaged. So it was really very telling, and a good lesson that you can't just rely on people's perception or memory, but getting that quantitative data was also critical. Next slide, please.
So with the client experience survey, so I mentioned them in the quantitative data section. The client experience surveys kind of had a quantitative data component, and they also had a qualitative data component. As I mentioned, we focused on communication because we felt like that was really one of the things that cuts at the crux of the attorney-client relationship, as opposed to questions like, did you like your attorney, right? Whether they were able to communicate, I think, really impacts an attorney's ability to represent a client effectively. So we asked a lot of questions related to communication. We asked about objective measures. We used as many objective measures as possible. But we also wanted to kind of create a space for clients to talk about their subjective experience in terms of communication and dealing with their attorneys. And that was really the qualitative aspect of the client experience surveys. And we got a lot of really interesting information, I think, from the clients. So these are just some quotes from both San Benito County and Kings County. So we got the hard data, right? Like, you know, this amount of folks only spoke to their attorneys for less than 5 minutes, right? Which is super significant in and of itself. But then you get more information about what that experience was like for clients. So not only did we barely speak, but he insisted that I take the first deal. Always talked loud to me and made me feel small. Spent months not knowing what was going on. In Kings, he would say that he would come speak with me and he wouldn't. So not like lack of follow through. I requested to see my lawyer several times and he never came. Or I would call multiple times and he must have had the number blocked or something. So it really allowed us to paint a broad and complete picture of not only the numbers and the data, which was extremely effective and extremely telling about what was happening, but actually, what the experience of a client's was in those counties that were going through those indigent defense systems, how that was really impacting them. And so collecting both the quantitative and qualitative data was really significant and important.
So trying to tie all of that together, I knew, and as defenders, of course, like we believe what our clients tell us in terms of what their experience is, or if they've, not had success in being able to communicate or tell their story, because we're used to amplifying our clients' voices and telling their side of the story. But I knew that in this rural conservative county, that if I just reported like, well, clients are saying that they can't communicate with their contract attorneys, and this is a huge failure of your system because there's no adequate access. And so I needed a few more pieces to add into that so people would believe that. So we knew that clients could not reach their attorneys, that attorneys did not have reliable avenues for clients to be able to access them, whether in custody or out. And then speaking to the sheriff and requesting the visitation data, the visitation logs, which attorneys have registered phone numbers with the jail. Sure enough, there are 10 of the contract attorneys that had not registered their phone number with the jail. Therefore, those clients could not make a confidential phone call to their attorney when they were locked up. Speaking with the transport deputies at the jail, I went to visit the jail captain. She was wonderful. She took me on a tour. We were in a break room. There were some transport deputies, and I just asked them, what's your experience? What do you notice about attorney visitation? And they very readily acknowledged that those with appointed counsel would get visitation from, or those with retained counsel, would receive visits from their attorney. The attorneys were just more present. They were more available. They accepted phone calls. Whereas appointed counsel, they said, no, we never see them around here. And we hear all the time from the inmates, hey, I can't get a hold of my attorney. How can I reach him? I need to talk to him. And then sure enough, this tied in with what the judges reported. So in California, if a client wants to fire their court-appointed attorney, it's called a Marsden hearing. It's a confidential hearing where the client reports to the judge, these are the problems I'm having with my attorney. I can't talk to him. That was the number one complaint, the number one reason for clients wanting their court-appointed attorney removed from the case, is that there's this lack of communication. Judge, I haven't seen my attorney since the last court date. I have no idea what's going on with my case. I'm in the dark. I need a new lawyer because this one just isn't working with me. Next slide. And over to Tatyana.
Thanks, Bridget. So that was really great. It's so exciting to be part of the team and work through with the team on these evaluations. But in addition to engaging in work to support opening PD offices, we also tried to provide support to keeping PD offices open as well. And so this is just going to be a really brief case study on how we sort of approach that endeavor. Next slide, please. Thank you, Laurel. So this is a chart from a county staffing report that we produced fairly recently at the behest of a public defender in Stanislaus County who wanted to advocate for additional attorney positions. So unlike the other counties we've evaluated, Stanislaus does in fact have an institutional public defender office. And basically the ask was for data to help support an increase in attorney staffing. So this is one of the charts we included in that. And we used population data from the census and the number of allocated attorney positions that we got from the budget. County budgets are the best, to calculate the size of each county's PD office in terms of attorney staffing. So essentially in this chart, we demonstrated that Stanislaus County has a smaller PD office per capita than other counties that were included in comparison. Next slide, please. And for the same report, we also use data from the Judicial Council on the number of case filings to demonstrate just very simply that Stanislaus has had an increase in case filings over the last few years, whereas every other comparison county saw a decrease. And then later in this report, we tie this information to attorney staffing. Because what we found out from the budgets was that attorney staffing had not increased to meet this influx of new cases over the last few years. However, the comparison counties, which did increase their attorney positions, but had decreases in case filings. So I thought that was a really good and important and hopeful point to make. Next slide, please. Another approach that we decided to use in this report was to use county budget and judicial county data to compare spending on indigent defense between two counties similar to Stanislaus County in terms of the proportion of total case filings that are felony filings. And as you can see here in this chart, Stanislaus County, Sacramento, and Fresno all have very similar high percentages of felony case filings, but of those three counties, Stanislaus County spends the least on their public defense. Sacramento is almost double, I think, there in terms of spending, but that was something we wanted to just look at. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm sure as everyone is aware, RAND released the National Public Defense Workload Study last year. The capacity building team here developed an amazing guide to help defenders in California apply the case types that you find in the study to common California offenses. So basically helping them map these offenses from the study to California. I also created an Excel tool that calculates available hours for attorneys, the number of hours required based on the distribution of case types, and the number of attorneys needed based on those hours in order for an office to provide effective and quality representation. And so using the original study, using the guide, and using the Excel tool allowed us really to speak to attorney workloads in our evaluations against, I think, what I haven't found before, which is a concrete standard. And thank you, Laurel, for going to the next slide. So this is an example of a table that we included in the Stanislaus report, advocating for additional attorney staffing. And here we use the National Public Defense Workload Study math, and the delineation of hours per case type. We use the distribution of cases from Stanislaus County and apply it to that. And then we use the Excel tool basically to do the math for us. And here we offer this table, which essentially delineates the number of attorney hours required for effective representation. At the bottom, you'll see that, dealing with math is not always easy, and it's not necessarily straightforward. But I thought the graphic on the bottom was the most helpful potentially, because you can see that in addition to the hours that we calculated based on caseloads and the number of hours that were available for attorneys, we came up with 55. But we also had to account for anything that any position that might have to do with some matters outside of adult criminal cases, because that's where the National Public Defense Workload Study goes. So we added a chief, a juvenile attorney, one post-conviction attorney, which totaled 58 attorneys. And I am happy to report that the person who requested our assistance came back and let us know that she was approved to hire 10 additional attorneys. And I think that was really cool. Okay, that's it.
Well,
Laurel.
thank you, team. You guys are doing amazing work. I'm happy to be a part of it. And we're happy to share all of the materials, our client surveys, our reports, our data requests, whatever you guys want, we can put them together and maybe IDRA can send them to the attendees. But I do want to open it up for questions. If you guys want to contact me, feel free to reach out and I can put you in touch with anybody on our team as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and invite Torin to invite us to answer questions in the chat. And if not, I will just pose some questions to the panel as well. Thank you.
So no questions in the chat yet. I do have some things I would like to ask, but I think we should start with what you have.
Okay, well, I guess I wanted to ask the group, what are we missing? You know, we're about to start another evaluation in Mariposa County, and we want to just pose a question to you guys to throw in the chat. What other data points are you collecting and from whom that we're missing that we should add to our evaluations for next time? There's a few things we didn't put in here, of course, because we wanted to limit the presentation. We do collect jury trial data and things like that. But just wondering if you guys wanted to throw that into the chat. We'd love to see it. And then Torin, I'll let you ask your questions.
Well, I will say that I don't think there's anything that we are able to collect in Indiana that you guys are not collecting, because I was very impressed by the level of information you guys were able to get. So that's very impressive. So Meg in the chat says percent represented by public versus private counsel. Is that something that you guys are able to get? I know it's a problem in Indiana for sure.
That's a toughie.
Something that I requested when I sent my data requests. I asked, you know, please divide this by appointed versus retained, and they said we don't collect that. So I even asked just the court, like, you know, is there a percentage you'd say that there's, you know, appointed counsel? So when I look at a specific data point, I can know well, 95% of the people in this county are represented by appointed counsel, and there just isn't anything. I know from my own experience and having worked in a neighboring community, I think I have a pretty fair perception that an overwhelming majority of people are represented by appointed counsel. But I think that's a really valid question, and it's something I really wish that I had been able to obtain, and will continue to seek that information from other counties and hope that we hit the jackpot somewhere and somebody actually does collect it.
Meg also added the judges way overestimate the percent represented. I think she means represented at all, like, but clarify if I'm incorrect in assuming that, Meg, because
Can I unmute? Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're good.
Since I can unmute, I thought we were doing the anyway.
Either is fine, I think, is the answer.
So I want to say I love your reports. I think this is really great work. The one thing, yeah, so that was one of the questions I had, because there are a few things that can happen with that also. Like it's one, it can help you control for the indigent defense versus DA budgets in some ways when you're making that comparison, which some people complain about as you're making the comparison. So it can help with that one. And then the other thing, though, is that I think there's interest in sort of whether or not the quality of the system, so like there's a feedback loop in the percent of people that actually get representation. So in systems with institutional defenders who can, because I think part of the thing that we see with institutional defenders is they're able to advocate for budgets in ways that particularly like contract systems are not, you know. And I mean, you all have San Mateo, so you kind of understand that there's like the weird outlier of managed assigned counsel that they are. And but I think that you know, a lot of that has to do with budgets and sort of how well people are able to advocate for budgets. And so and then they're also able to advocate for better like rules for indigency. Like, I don't know how strict they are in California. In Texas, where I work, they're set by the county. So the county gets to decide sort of what your measure of indigency is. And so when you have institutional defenders, they're also able to advocate for client or for the community in ways like that, which so you may actually see higher appointment rates, you know, when you have these state institutional defenders. I think the other thing that just I mean, so I think like showing the budgets is great. I think there's always going to be the question of like, well, what if one's doing it so much better than the other? And so like maybe Stanislaus is just, you know, rocking the ship, but I mean, they apparently don't think that at all. And like Sacramento's just way overspending. You know, that's like the kind of story people like to tell. So any data that would sort of speak to that kind of stuff, like the incarceration data, you may show that to the counties. But looking at that across the counties with the budgets might be interesting.
Thank you for those suggestions, Meg. That's great.
There was a message in the chat. It says this is from Jessica Tyler. This is more of a footnote, but when y'all ask for the expert request, I tried to figure out if the case was appointed or on a retained lawyer filing or a retained lawyer filing an AKE motion. Okay, sorry, I confused myself there. I mean, your numbers are horrifically low enough, but it's an even bigger punch to say, and half of those are for people who could afford counsel, but not experts.
Yes, great idea.
I will say, so we don't have those numbers in Indiana in terms of on a case level data, but I am positive our numbers are lower than yours, which is depressing because we have counties that in a multi-year period have spent $0 on investigators. So I know. So presumably the percentage is 0%, right? There you could imagine a scenario where maybe one person got an expert somehow, but seems unlikely.
So, Torin, did you have any other questions or I can just go ahead?
Yeah. Well, I'll,
okay.
So I don't know, this is kind of a question or a strategy comparison maybe, which is, so you guys spent a lot of time on like things like showing under-resourcedness and also showing like this is bad for clients, right? In my experience in Indiana, which is a very different set of stakeholders, that information like we don't spend that much time on because we don't expect it to be particularly convincing. So what we spend a lot of time on is like other hits to the system, which you guys did talk a little bit about, like incarcerated population and stuff like that. But like our reports, the first number is jail rates and converting that jail rate with a per diem into a dollar amount, because that's the thing that people care about. So I wondered if like, are you guys actually, do you think stakeholders there are actually very receptive to like the things that I think they should be receptive to and not just the bottom line? Or is that something that you guys look at? Is it something that you use differently in different counties? Stuff like that.
Ashanti, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I think you're right, it's nuanced and it kind of depends on your audience. Like the data is the data, but I think you're right, absolutely. Certain things stand out to certain folks. In San Bernardino County, the leadership in the county was particularly moved by the way it was impacting the clients. And I think part of the background was that they had been getting a lot of complaints from clients and from clients' family members. And so everyone in the system was really concerned about how it was impacting the clients, including the district attorneys, the line DAs, the district attorney. And in fact, when we presented to the Board of Supervisors, there was I did my presentation and then there was an opportunity for public comment. And the sheriff in San Benito called in to comment to the Board of Supervisors and said that he was very bothered by the low number of motions to suppress, and basically said like, hey, if my police officers got in trouble, like I would want them to have a good attorney. Like everyone deserves to have a good attorney. And in fact, my officers need to be tested, and the system needs to be tested. And this is a learning experience and no one's perfect. And if they don't have to go to court and be cross-examined, and maybe lose a motion to suppress every once in a while, then how do we know that they're doing a good job? So that was moving to them. I don't know that that would have the same impact in every county or every sheriff would respond to that in the same way. But it certainly was impactful. Focusing on the clients was impactful in San Benito County.
Bridgid, I think you should maybe tell the story of Kings and the sheriff there being kind of proud of the incarceration rate.
Right. So Torrin, I think, Kings County, California is probably a lot more like some of the places in Indiana than you might expect than it is, similar to some places in California. I can't emphasize enough like how law and order this county is. And I wish I had more data and more information to share, like what you were talking about. Like, look at how much this is costing you. Look at how much this is costing your county. I think that would have maybe landed a little better. Although I will say that during my stakeholder interviews, people did bring up the notion of fairness, and even the sheriff and the district attorney, like the people you wouldn't necessarily think would be so concerned with fairness to the accused, they did mention it. And they did say like, hey, that's important to me. So yes, the sheriff was like, well, I'm proud of our incarceration rate. We're tough on crime here. That's how it is. And it's a little bit more nuanced in trying to explain how, I'm certainly not blaming the defenders for the incarceration rate. Defenders have the least amount of power of anyone in the courtroom aside from their clients that they're defending, right? But to say that like this is a symptom of a whole system that's just going to collapse on itself. And so I was kind of hoping in between the lines that people would read between the lines and say, our system is bad and we're going to get sued. We're vulnerable here. And, we need to make adjustments, and it's not outside the realm of possibility. I think it's a rational thing to think because some of their neighboring counties have been sued for issues, related to indigent defense. So that's a long-winded answer, but I wish I had maybe focused a little bit more on the fiscal impact, because I think ultimately that people in Kings County care a lot about that.
I will say, like, the incarceration stuff is like the ultimate low-hanging fruit for fiscal stuff because it costs so much money. Like, it is so expensive to incarcerate even for a very short period of time. So that is always the first go-to. And then I know you guys aren't. So Indiana is a state where the family defense stuff is lumped in. So keeping kids in foster care is also quite expensive in the sense that, in a fiscal sense, in addition to, the obvious social sense. Laurel, did you have another question to bring to the group?
Oh, I mean, I have plenty of questions.
Sure.
I want to give other people an opportunity to ask, but if not, I'm happy to step in and kind of field some questions.
Yeah, I think we can go to another one.
Okay, so Tatyana, could you talk about some of the data challenges you experienced with the quantitative data?
Yeah, and I think some of that has already been touched on, but I think it's what we would expect as researchers to come across, and that's missing data, inconsistent data, and data just not defined in a way that's usable for you. So I think Bridget had a great example about the lack of data. It was was it Marsden or?
Marsden, I think it.
Yeah, it was
conflicted.
Marsden, right, Bridget? Marsden data that we wanted to collect from courts, and they didn't collect it. We tried to collect Marsden motions from San Benito, and we wanted it for both Marsden hearings and requested both orally and in writing. And I think the court only recorded requests, was it in writing, Ashanti, or orally? One or the other. So, but then we went out and tried to ask the comparison counties the same questions, but then they wouldn't have that information, or they collected it a different way. So these data points that I feel are important to compare across counties, like Bridget said, you know, they're not necessarily helpful in a vacuum, and the data is just not available. You know, the counties that we evaluate, I think, are more than likely lacking a case management system or any system at all for any sort of data collection. And so we go out and we try to piecemeal information, you know, from other entities. But that's not to say that the district attorney in the county or the court in the county, their data collection practices are much better. There are never any data dictionaries. Data dictionaries are so common in research, and they're very important, as researchers may understand, but there are never any data dictionaries that accompany any data we get from any government entity to try and piecemeal some of this data. So, you know, sometimes we have to make a choice of not including data elements because we can't compare across counties, and this data element may not be helpful in a vacuum. Sometimes Ashanti and I ordered the annual, or requested an annual number of case filings through the court in San Benito and through the district attorney, and got two different sets of numbers for both. So there's like inconsistency, and you know, you have to kind of dig and ask questions. Well, is there anything I should know about this variable and the way it's coded? Because there are no data dictionaries. So I think, you know, it really comes down to these three buckets of missing data, inconsistent data, or unusable data. I think that's pretty much it. And to the extent that we can, of course, we try to validate the data or through other sources. I think with San Benito, we decided that, you know, we're using I think the court data more consistently, or perhaps the DA data. And so we stuck with just one source rather than trying to combine them. And of course, you know, we made it a point to reference where the data we received was from. So if anything, you know, if there's inconsistencies potentially in that data, you know, what can we do? So I think those have been the biggest challenges.
Thanks, Tatyana. I want to throw this out to the group because I know there's a lot of wisdom in this room. So I presented to Del Norte, Ashanti presented to San Benito, and Bridget presented to Kings, to their board of supervisors per their request. And we did these reports, and they're all compelling. But all the counties have kind of ducked and hid and chosen to kind of keep their contract systems and sort of change things around the edges. So we kind of went up to bat 3 times and in essence struck out a little bit. So I'm just sort of wondering what you guys have for wisdom for us, you know, given that we can't force anybody to do anything, what moves you would recommend our state taking, even if it's not our agency, with these reports. And I'll just let you guys put in the chat, or you can come off mute. And there are certain limitations for our agency because we work for the executive, but just wondering if anybody has any ideas that they want to put in the chat. And while you guys are doing that, I just want to kind of turn to Ashanti. and ask you, what was one of the most impactful moments where the data really spoke to you about how bad things are, and how did you use the data to tell a story?
So I think there were a couple. One was that particular survey question about the amount of time that clients spent with their attorney on felony cases. I think also just thinking about the data, because our evaluations were so kind of heavy and data rich. So taking a step back and thinking about, for example, in San Benito County, the attorneys had over 400 misdemeanors and over 100 felony cases for each attorney. So it was over 500 cases each. And so like there were just a lot of numbers and a lot of data throughout our reports and throughout my presentation. I think taking a step back and thinking about what that meant in terms of an attorney having 500 clients, and that means it's 500 people, and that means it's 500 police reports that the attorney has to read, might be 500 sets of body-worn camera footage that the attorney has to review. It might be, 500 phone calls from family members, but essentially that it's, 500 people's lives that are impacted by this system, and that this attorney is responsible for. So I think thinking about things like that, the amount of cases and how that impacts people, and the amount of time that attorneys are spending talking to clients, and thinking about that in terms of like, what does that conversation look like, and how can you really talk about all the important things and answer all the important questions in that amount of time? And the answer is you really can't. But I think just thinking about the numbers themselves, I think those two specific numbers, the caseloads and then the time, but also just thinking about it in a human way of like, what does that actually look like for the people that really matter, and the people that are really impacted by this.
Bridgid, did you want to take the same question, which is sort of what was one of the most impactful moments for you in doing these evaluations?
Sure. I would say definitely the lack of investigation and the just abysmally low number of expert requests. I mean, that was over a 5-year period, only 49 expert requests. So I think those were very jarring. And then I didn't have a slide on this. I requested the data for the number of Marsden hearings. So again, the number of times a client requested to fire or replace their court-appointed attorney for ineffective assistance of counsel or a breakdown in the attorney-client relationship. So over a 5-year period, there were 672 of those requests to fire their attorney. And then I broke it down by, court days, like took out weekends, holidays, added a day back in for the leap year. And it worked out to a Marsden hearing every other day. And that's a huge amount of time for the court. The judge has to clear the courtroom. I mean, and again, I requested the same data from neighboring Tulare County, which has 3 times the number of cases and more than double the number of appointed attorneys. And they had 394 of those over that 5-year period compared to 672 in the much smaller county with much fewer cases and fewer attorneys. So again, I don't, just because somebody wants to fire their lawyer doesn't mean the lawyer has necessarily done something wrong, but I think there is the other data points pointed to the attorneys being to blame on a significant portion of that. So the judges reporting, hey, during these hearings, they're always saying, that they're not hearing from their attorney, that they can't reach their attorney. Okay, 1 or 2 or 5 clients say that, but then you have 672 that are saying, my attorney doesn't call me back. I don't know what's going on with my case. My attorney hasn't spent time with me and gotten my side of the story. I could just feel like this, sense of frustration and how those clients must feel and feeling so hopeless, because in this contract system, there's no other recourse for them except to ask the judge. I want a new lawyer. They don't have an office to call. There's no supervisor to complain to. You know, when I was a public defender, a trial attorney, if I didn't return a phone call, you know, my supervisor would eventually hear about it. Or if my supervisor was on vacation, there was a different supervisor, or, you know, you could go up the chain. And there was a way for, you know, someone to step in and help me if I was in trial and I couldn't respond to somebody's inquiry. There's a colleague there who had the same attorney-client privilege and the same access to the client file that could help. So it really just drove home for me that these attorneys are just on their own. There's really a lack of accountability. And so there's really no downside for the attorney. I don't have to return my client's phone calls. I don't have to register my phone number with the jail. There's no consequences for me as an attorney. And you'd hope that their own ethics and professionalism and that they would care enough about their clients, but you know, the data indicates otherwise.
I just want to briefly follow up on that, and then get back to the responses in the chat. But I had so Indiana is currently looking at revising how misdemeanors work, because currently it's a complicated, but right now, like misdemeanors, they can kind of do whatever they want. Other stuff, there's rules. And I was interviewing an attorney who was actually advocating to not have that change made, and they do a lot of misdemeanor work, primarily because they didn't want to reduce the amount of contracts that they could take. But a quote from them was that they said one of their staff people said to them, if every one of your clients wanted to meet with you, there's no way you would have time to do that. And I was like, that seems like a problem, right? Like, and the consequence of that is that, you know, for many of these clients, they get to misdemeanor court and they haven't met, like they've never met this person. And I'm sure, you know, that's not all on them, right? Like, at least according to them, and I do believe them, they reach out to every client, but that should be a problem, right? If you aren't able to meet with that client, then you should be something needs to change. And if you definitely don't have the capacity to do that, then that's clearly a serious problem. Laurel, if you don't mind, I'm gonna get responses to your questions. So Meg was the first one to say financial support for new offices. I imagine you guys have thought of that, but you know, it's resources being what they are. And I totally agree, though. Opening new offices for us either comes from a change in local sentiment, which is usually a change in local people who are elected, or offering some money. And then both I and Jessica suggested the possibility of regionalization. So I think so you guys have 58 counties. Indiana has 92. I think you said 58. And you can guess which state has more population. So I think it is a bigger problem for Indiana, but I am curious if, like, is that something that you guys have floated at all? Like, or is there regionalization in anything else? Like, do you guys have regionalized DAs? We do not.
We've been pushing it at conferences and meetings with supervisors and county administrators. Nobody's taken the bait yet, but we're going to keep shaming them that Texas is more advanced than California, with the hope that they'll be
in Indiana. We have one.
Okay, Indiana, Michigan. There's a lot of states that have regional, and so we would love to move in that direction if anybody's willing.
Yeah, that is definitely the problem, getting the local counties to not fight rather. And then so there's an answer from Maria Beeman regarding advocacy for the state. Could you summarize the findings of your evaluations and underscore the inequity and impacts to clients across counties, and use that to advocate for the state to invest in money and supports for public defense at the county level to erase that inequity? The county comparisons are powerful, she says.
Great idea, Maria. Does anyone want to unmute and just give us your wisdom? Because, you know, we're working here together for the same goal. Or any researchers on board that maybe want to share their insight. Tatyana, do you want to share with the other researchers, you know, as a data person, what advice would you give to other data people in the room?
Sure. Yes, thank you, Laurel, for asking that. I feel like I'm going to change my answer now. I had an answer before, but now I feel like I'm going to change it because the audience, I feel like, knows quite a bit of information. But basically, I think, you know, outside of I have a PhD, so I have a lot of like sophisticated statistical training, and I have not been able to use any of it in this role, and that's good and okay, because keeping it simple is something that I think is very powerful when at least presenting to a governing body. So keeping it simple, keeping it straightforward. When I do that, Laurel and Ashanti and Bridget are better able to speak to the visuals without having to unpack a lot of information. So I think keeping it simple is a lesson I've learned. Just being prepared for negative attitudes regarding data sharing. That was, you know, I went from a PhD to the DOJ, and the DOJ is somewhat forthcoming within the DOJ about sharing data, right? Like that's not necessarily such a big thing. But coming here and seeing so much resistance, you know, from to us who are just literally just trying to be helpful here if we can be. But that Laurel mentioned about, you know, counties feeling judged and rural counties just maybe not even keeping any data at all. I think that was really shocking to me. So be prepared for that. Get stakeholder buy-in as early as possible. Have a backup plan if you can't get the data you think you're going to get. Think about other proxy data you might be able to use. If you get a yes, jump into a data sharing agreement if you can, or an MOU in case they change their mind later. Yeah, I think that's the advice that I would give a researcher coming to the field. But it sounds like from the audience, you're all learned people in this regard.
I still think it's great advice. I'll pass this off to Neil, who's raised their hand.
Hi, yeah, I'm research analyst with the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. So, you know, we have 83 counties, 120 funding units, and some regional offices. You know, about a third of our offices are PD offices, and about, you know, 2/3 are MAC systems. So we've got kind of all of this. We also have, you know, state standards, and, you know, we did $280 million in state grants to locals. So we're coming from a different perspective. But, you know, we are wrestling kind of with the same question of how to demonstrate the value of a particular model. We have a statute that guarantees local control. So the local system, the local funding unit gets to decide what kind of system, but they must meet our standards, right? So we approach this from kind of a different place. And so one of the questions that I'm very interested in that, you know, we have yet to be able to answer, and it's kind of hard to answer from, you know, the national data, is can we use, you know, there's evidence that public defender offices have all of these benefits, right? But we don't really know how far those benefits go if you consider the fact that we have standards that also apply to the contract systems. And because one of the problems is these contract systems, the lesser oversight, the lesser standards, potential higher, all these things, we also have mandates on them. And so trying to weigh those things makes it, you know, we have in some ways better data, in some ways worse data than you have. But we have this other variable that I can't go out. It's very hard for me to go out and find like a comparison outside of Michigan to say, I think this is true because, and so we run into those same problems. You know, we also, you know, speaking to some of the other questions, we also had, you know, we had a really damning report about indigent defense in Michigan come out 15 or 20 years ago that led to the creation of our agency and everything. And that was a multi-year effort to get the legislature to care about it. It was then a multi-year effort to build the standards, a multi-year effort to implement the grants. 6 months from now, we are finally going to put the last standard online, right? And so it's been a very long process to sort of build this up. And I would still tell you, nowhere near enough requests for experts, even though we pay for 100% of it, right? You know, so it's, you know, the thing that I've been thinking about as we've been talking is, so much of this is still based on the local culture, even if you give them the money. And I mean, I don't know if that's makes people feel worse about the situation or not. But you know, some of these problems we did not even solve with giving them 100, 97% of the money they needed. So it's, you know, I think, you know, getting little bits, little good snippets of data to convince individual people along the way is actually maybe more powerful than it may seem. I don't know. That was a variety of responses, but that's what I've been thinking.
Thank you. That was very reassuring, Neil. You know, we appreciate the incremental and the advice.
Yeah, it's just another example where, as I said, we're changing the misdemeanor rules, and like our number one fear is that people are going to spend the exact, we're going to cut their caseload in half, and they're going to spend the exact same amount of time per case because that's the expectation. And then a lot of these people are part-time, so they'll pick up more private work or something like that. And that is like the number one thing we're trying to avoid. And our hope is to do it with training. But yeah, if anyone has thoughts on that, I would love to.
Well, yeah, I want to add to that. So one of the things, so we just last year implemented our compensation standard, and then we're about to implement a standard on caseloads and qualifications and things of that nature. And one of the things that I'm tasked with is we have language in our standard that so if you're salaried is one version, one potential model, direct hourly is another model, and then there are these other contract, event-based payment structures, whatever. And one of the things that the standard says is your compensation model cannot be a disincentive to quality representation. And are trying to figure out how to measure that, given the data situation that you're all speaking to, is very challenging, because how do we compare? How do we know something is a disincentive to quality representation? One question is, do they spend fewer hours working on a case? Are they incentivized to work more or fewer hours? But then does that even matter? In theory, we would say more hours on a case is good, but like, can we actually prove that? Because we would have to go, if we were going to say a system, you are non-compliant and we're going to initiate this non-compliance process, we would have to be able to prove that their attorneys actually were disincentivized to quality representation. And that's a very challenging thing to do, even if we had the data that, perfect data. And so that's, it's a very complicated thing to see, and it requires so much data collection. We have data collection requirements for the local funding units, and they report to us every quarter all these different metrics. And these are people who should be incentivized to give us this data because we're using it for their benefit, and it's pulling teeth, right, to get some of it from some places. So it's a challenge even from the folks on our side of the conversation.
Go ahead, Meg.
Okay, it wouldn't unmute me. I tried.
Now
Yeah, I wanted to echo the sentiments, and I would love, so I've been doing this for a while now. When we started looking at outcome measures. So I've spent a lot of time looking at outcome measures. I work in Travis County, Texas. We have a recent PD and manage assigned counsel system. And so there's a lot going on now. And I predate the PD. So originally we were looking at the manage assigned counsel system implementation. And even though I have an incredible amount of data, it's limited to things like outcomes. Gathering client data is really hard. Like, I would be interested in what your response rates are, because that's something that we're going to do in our county. We've been trying to do more of it, but those kinds of things are hard. And I agree, it's all been incremental. So I started about the same time Michigan started. So I think all of this has grown. I think we as a community have been really good at sort of sharing that information. So I'm excited about what you all are doing and sort of pushing the envelope as much as we can as a community to sort of figure out these problems. But yeah, how your client surveys, did you guys get good? Or I guess you don't know the whole universe because you did it sort of through intermediaries, but did
Yeah,
you get?
I mean, when we put stacks at the nonprofits, we got very few responses, the churches, the homeless shelters, things like that. But when we sent in a stack through the county council to the sheriff to the jail, and basically the first question was, don't answer questions about your current cases, but only if you've been represented before, like answer this set of questions for last time. And you know, the same day we came out with like 42 responses, whoever was sitting in the jail. So I think to the extent that you can use your captive audience, it's a little easier. The probation officer, I think, was pretty helpful for people wandering into the offices, but we don't know like who declined to answer. We did translate it into Spanish, so we had that opportunity as well. But I think I don't think it matters how many you get exactly. It's just like consistency among what they answer.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like some is better than the information in it itself, like what they're saying. If they say it consistently matters. And so I think that's interesting. In this group, we've had a lot of conversations sort of about client surveys and thinking about the client perspective and, you know, what matters and all of those things. And so I'm just interested in, you know, what you all did. But I think, you know, it's impressive that you did anything is first thing, frankly. Getting any client's information. I think our sheriff would balk at giving out something. They'd be like, oh, we don't have enough staff to give out this piece of paper. You know, which may be true, but it's just like, okay, I'm not gonna push it. So yeah, anyway, I was just curious.
All right, we are coming up at the end here. If another question pops in quickly, I will interrupt myself. But I wanted to thank you guys for coming. This is, as someone in a very similar but very different situation. It's great to see and like kind of compare notes more than anything. So and it is nice to think that even if I did move to California, I would still have some problems, right? But I really appreciated the stuff that you guys presented, and we definitely hope to see you back here at IDRA, and you know, just in individual communications. Laurel, if there's anything you do want to share, I've encouraged people to reach out to you guys, and we do provide that. But if there's anything you want to share, I mean, you can feel free to send it to the IDRA list, but you can also send it to me, and I can disperse it there. That's totally fine as well. For everyone else, we will be back here in tomorrow at noon Eastern for our last 2 sets of presentations, and I hope to see you all there. And again, thank you guys so much. This was great.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
Take
Thank
care.
you.